I recently got insanely lucky and found this near mint condition CRT TV for just 25 bucks. Homie was literally keeping it in his garage, and yet it's not even dusty. And after digging through the deepest depths of my closet and finally finding the right cables, I was able to hook up my old Sega Genesis and PlayStation 2 and re-experience my favorite childhood games in all their retro glory. So today I want to explore why, in the age of endless legacy sequels, HD collections, remakes, remasters, reignited trilogies, anniversary editions, and even emulation, we are still going out of our way to experience video games that are older than us through the dated and objectively less capable hardware available at the time, and why we continue to recreate those experiences in the games we make today. First and foremost, remakes sometimes just miss. So much of what makes a game great comes down to presentation. Would Metal Gear Solid be as celebrated as it is if it had the exact same gameplay but static images and text boxes instead of cutscenes?
It's Snake. I'm in front of the disposal facility.
Not those. Those are cool. And actually, Metal Gear Solid 1 has already had a remake that dropped the ball on presentation. The Twin Snakes is often panned by Metal Gear fans for its absurdly over-the-top cutscenes, which is saying a lot by Metal Gear standards, and its features carried over from MGS2's gameplay that don't translate well to the design structure of MGS1. But in all honesty, the action scenes are really fun to watch, and the gameplay changes and removal backtracking are actually really engaging from a speedrunner's perspective. The reason I hardly ever find myself returning to Twin Snakes comes down solely to its presentation. I'll often return to MGS1 specifically to enjoy the atmosphere. The compressed voices and cold green portraits on the codec mixed with snow falling and the sound of the wind howling, it makes me want to turn off the heat in the winter and wrap up in a blanket burrito and see my breath while I play. The Twin Snakes just feels sterile by comparison. The music and sound design play a huge part, but the graphics in particular. MGS2's graphic style was revolutionary at the time, and that game still holds up stylistically, but its style slapped on top of MGS1 just doesn't translate. The anniversary edition of Halo CE is guilty of this too. I like the look of Halo Reach, and I don't think that game would be improved if it switched places with Halo CE's flat, polygonal style, but there are entire video essays about how the Halo Reach graphics that were ported in for the anniversary edition of the game ruined the presentation and atmosphere of the mission 343 Guilty Spark, which was originally framed almost more like something out of a horror game than a first-person shooter, but got cleaned up and sterilized in the remake. I'd also argue the anniversary graphics are dissonant with Halo 1's level design, much of which is essentially copy and pasted rooms that give a sort of labyrinthian feel to the levels. As a kid, I liked getting lost playing Halo, but as an adult, the visual clarity helps me to keep my bearings. And it's the simple and utilitarian graphics that make the in-game architecture feel simple and utilitarian. In the anniversary graphics, the added detail starts to become distracting visual noise that ironically calls a lot more attention to the copy and pasted nature of the design, and I find myself getting lost in that visual clutter more often. I find this loss of the OG sauce to be true of pretty much every major remake that comes out. Sure, I love the Spyro Reignited trilogy, and at 4K, it's one of the most beautiful games I've ever played, but I'll be honest, it kinda looks like a Fortnite mod. Despite the limitations of hardware, almost every video game made before the late 2000s had something distinct about its art style. And to be clear, it's not just a matter of they don't make games like they used to. It's a matter of simplicity, because simplicity is deceptively flexible and simplicity is timeless. It doesn't matter if it's the 8-bit sprite art of Shovel Knight or the hand-drawn dreary look of Hollow Knight. Both use self-imposed limitations to enhance their respective experience. Sonic Superstars already looks more dated than Sonic Mania, in my opinion. Melee is a great example as well. Yes, when you compare the gameplay footage, you can see that Brawl has the technically superior graphics, but does anyone really wish that Melee was as, gray as Brawl is? That might be a separate issue though. I swear, there was a time from like 2006 to 2010 where every game thought it was cool to look as boring and desaturated as possible. Even a game called Sonic fucking Colors looks flat and lifeless compared to Sonic Generations that came out just a year later. But even then, Fallout 1 and 2 have flat coloring and these ugly ass clay models and just overall look like complete shit. And I fucking love it. Look at Medieval. This animation looks like dookie butt cheeks, and I can't get enough of it. The later Fallout games, realism. The Medieval remake, Fortnite. And I've got to admit, nostalgia does play a part. You know, back in the cartridge era, your games were saved, if the game even had a save function, on the cartridge itself. When I set up my new CRT and booted up my copy of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, my jaw dropped when I saw my saves load up. There was a time when I stopped in the middle of the adventures this cartridge was taking me on, for the last time. Well, I don't remember what that last time was. The cartridge remembers, and on my shelf, the cartridge has waited. I can't talk about how cool retro games are and not take a moment to appreciate that experience. But graphically, there's something beyond that. If you really want to get nitpicky, there are some subtle gameplay differences in the Sonic Origins collection, for example, to how the original games played. But even if the gameplay were exactly the same, or somehow objectively better, I'd still go out of my way to play the originals. In fact, I even have a PS2 game called Sonic Mega Collection that is celebrated for having the most faithful ports of the Genesis Sonic games of any collection before or since, and I can even play it on my CRT, and yet it still doesn't quite hit the spot, the same as shoving the cartridge my dad gave me when I was 4 years old into a Genesis and booting up the original hardware. But again, it's not just the nostalgia. Even the way the Genesis, the PS2, and modern systems display the graphics is different. I love pixel-perfect emulators and super sharp visuals for modern sprite-based games, but games designed on CRTs had CRTs in mind when their art was made, in a way that even modern sprite art doesn't take into consideration. Look at these waterfalls in Green Hill Zone, for example. With the pixel-perfect look, we can see that all it is a foreground layer of every other pixel being a line of water, and each of those lines has a cycle of shades of blue to simulate falling water. Looks neat and all as it is, but when we boot up the Sonic Mega Collection version on a CRT, something cool happens. There's color bleed from the lines of water into the neighboring pixels, and from the neighboring pixels into the water lines. And so suddenly we see this beautiful mist of water overlaid on top of the mountain behind it. It goes even one step further when we boot up the Genesis version. The digital noise in the video signal from the Genesis creates a distortion when the colors blend that gives this almost rainbow effect of the water's mist. No scanline filter on a 4K TV is gonna emulate that. You don't just remember pixel art games looking better, they looked better. But there's one more reason we keep coming back to retro game graphics that I've never seen anyone talk about. Have you ever thought about why, in a time where people can barely be bothered to go see a movie in theaters anymore, that live performance theater still survives? There's probably entire video essays here on YouTube talking about why that is, but one of the major contributing factors that makes the experience of theater unique is live theater's distinct level of abstraction. The level of abstraction of any given art form is the gap between what you see and hear and what your imagination fills in. When you read a book, the experience of the story is shaped almost entirely by your imagination, whereas a movie is more concrete and predetermined. And we only have to suspend our disbelief so much as to accept what we see on screen to be the world the characters live in. If we ever see the actors as real people playing pretend, we lose our emotional investment. So when we see live theater and are forced to ignore that these people are standing in front of us wearing microphones, but are somehow unaware that they are in a room full of people watching them, our reward as the audience for putting in that extra effort to suspend our disbelief is higher engagement and investment in the story. After all, what better way to make something more personal than by having it be partially a product of your own imagination? So then it all comes back to video games. The more abstract a game's visuals are, the more work your mind has to do to accept the game's reality, and the more engaging to your imagination the game will be. When I was a kid, I used to look to the cities and the mountains in the background of Spring Yard Zone and Sonic 1 and think about what kind of people lived there and what it would be like to climb those mountains. I can still just stare off into the distance in the PlayStation Spyro games for hours and appreciate the skyboxes and all of the possible wonders that lie beyond them. I subjectively find these skyboxes alone more beautiful than any landscape found in the Reignited trilogy. The Halo 2 anniversary cutscenes are beautifully rendered and incredibly captivating, but nothing in any new Halo game is ever going to beat the feeling of walking out of the downed Pelican and seeing the bending horizon of the Halo ring for the first time. It's the reason the first Zelda game still feels like the most magical and mysterious entry in the franchise, and why the original Metroid feels much more lonely and isolated than its sequels. Speaking of which, this gap between what you objectively experience through your senses and what your imagination fills in is where the entire horror genre lives. After all, the best way to keep a horror movie engaging is to never show the monster. I promise not to show jump scares or any gross out stuff in this video, by the way, but it's worth mentioning the correlation between lack of graphical definition in horror games and how subjectively scary we find those games to be. A lot of people find the PlayStation era Silent Hills and Resident Evils to be scarier than anything that came after. And the scariest game I've ever played is Power Drill Massacre, which emulates the graphics of the PlayStation era. You go a step further and you get LSD Dream Emulator, a PlayStation game exclusive to Japan that is little more than a nonsensical walk through environments inspired by a dream journal the developer kept. A step further than that and you get Dwarf Fortress, which has no distinctly defined graphics. Step further than that, you get Zork, and a step further than that, you get Dungeons and Dragons. Everyone has their preferences, but just like there's room in the world for endless amazing books and movies, there's always going to be value in games across the spectrum of abstraction, from realistic simulators all the way to D&D. And in the space between is where retro games scratch an itch unlike anything else. And if you're like me and you have a deep appreciation for retro games, check out my video, Cool Details and Secrets in Sonic 1. It's on screen now, where I talk about just some of the lesser known things that make the original Sonic the Hedgehog so special.